This morning's parable brings back memories for me of when I arrived in Waco 20 years ago to begin my tenure at Central Texas MCC. The salary was significantly less than what I make now, so I knew I would have to find a part-time job. I applied at a temp agency and soon found myself working weeknights on a production line at Allergan from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I needed the job, so I would make a point to always arrive early so the person signing in folks would know I was eager to work. Depending on what needed to be done, everyone might be hired on a particular evening, or only some of the folks might be hired. It was the prerogative of the person who signed in folks to pick and choose who worked and who was sent home. Throughout the evening and early morning hours, I would try to work steady, always staying focused on what I was supposed to be doing, because I quickly learned that the hardest workers were more likely to be chosen to work, and I needed the extra income if I hoped to make ends meet. I needed the job, but probably not as much as some of the others. I was single with only myself and my pet dog to feed. Others were trying to support a family, and sometimes they probably had to choose between paying the rent or utilities and eating. When given a choice like that, they and their kids more than likely would occasionally have to skip a meal. Nearly 1 in 6 children in the U.S. are food insecure, and in South Texas, it's 1 in 2. In this morning's parable, Jesus tells a story with some similarities to my time at Allergan. It's a tale about some people needing a job and a landowner who was looking for workers to tend his vineyard. So he went out early in the morning to the marketplace, and finding some folks who were searching for employment, he signed them all up and sent them out to the production line of his vineyard. Later in the morning, he returned to the marketplace and found more people looking for work. So he sent them out to his vineyard as well, promising to pay them a just salary. He repeated the process at noon and at mid-afternoon, each time giving the folks at the marketplace some work at his vineyard. He even returned at 5 p.m. with just an hour left on the clock. And sure enough, he found folks needing a job. When he asked why they were looking for work at this late hour in the day, they told him no one would hire them. So he sent them off to work for an hour in his vineyard. And at the end of the work shift, when it came time to pay the workers their salary, to the dismay of those who had worked the full 8 hours, they received the same pay as those who had only worked an hour. And so they complained to the landowner. And quite frankly, I would have done the same thing. Some folks interpret this morning's parable as an allegory in which salvation is the salary awarded to those who worked in the vineyard. In this interpretation, Gentiles have arrived at the end of the day, so to speak. But God, who is represented as the benevolent landowner, welcomes everyone, even us late on the scene Gentiles, awarding us the same measure of grace as those who have been working for a much longer time. This interpretation works nicely for you and me with our 21st century Christian point of view. But I suspect when it was offered to first century Jews, it may not have been seen as an allegory about salvation, but instead a more straightforward account about life as it was at the time. If we do a little background work about the economy of ancient Galilee, we'll learn that traditional landowners were being pushed off their family land by newcomers with wealth and connections to Roman political power. And so, read from this angle, our parable introduces us to people who have stood idle in the marketplace because their farms and vineyards had been confiscated by these newcomers. So what if the vineyard owner in the parable is one of the Jewish landowners who had not been pushed off his land yet? And what if he is trying to make things right by hiring people who have been dispossessed of their land? And when he promised to pay a fair wage, that would have been the money it would have taken to feed a family. Those who were not hired would have nothing to feed their children, so the landowner decided to pay them all enough to feed their families. Seen from this perspective, it becomes a story about people who may have arrived late not because they were lazy or shiftless, but because they may have had another part-time job or a night job, or because they had a sick kid at the house and they were a single parent. It's a story about someone who cared more about people than about making a profit or getting credit for their good deeds. You don't see this kind of selfless concern for the well-being of other people very often, but sometimes you do. On Sunday, August 21st, 2005, I stood at the pulpit asking the congregation to be in prayer for the unfolding of a worst-case scenario that everyone in New Orleans had always feared. 2 days later, a Category 5 hurricane that went by the name of Katrina made landfall, leaving 1,800 people dead and $125 billion in damage. With millions of other people, I watched with horror the news reports of thousands of people who were stranded in the burning heat on rooftops, on the top of bridges, and in the Superdome, with helicopters dropping water and food supplies to them until they could be rescued. With law enforcement otherwise overwhelmed with the chaos, the streets became a war zone as looters wandered the neighborhoods and business owners protected their stores with loaded shotguns. What followed was a mass exodus of the city like no one had ever seen. Evacuees who had lost their homes took refuge in cities wherever they could find a place to stay, including our own. I witnessed selflessness from all walks of life, with people donating clothes, food, and water. Our church became one of several drop-off sites in the city. I remember overseeing the preparation of what seemed like mountains of jambalaya and tubs of red beans and sausage for a nearby church which was providing food for the evacuees in our city. Like the landowner in our parable, they were all making sure that everyone's needs were supplied. Everyone was chipping in. That sort of generosity would continue when 3 months later our church began serving the first clients of what would come to be known as the Red Door Pantry. Were it not for support from the community at large, in particular local drag queens who raised funds to get it started, our pantry would not exist. Again, like the landowner in this morning's parable, our goal was to feed the hungry. But wherever you find benevolence, you will also find grumbling. Notice that in our parable, the workers who were hired first grumbled against the landowner who might have been just trying to help people who had lost possession of their land. I remember hearing people who complained that we needed to serve not just the HIV community, but everyone, even though we all knew we were in no position to effectively serve that large a number of people. But in the words of Mother Teresa, if you can't feed 100 people, then feed just one. Others complained because we included cookies in our distribution. Just as the workers who worked 8 hours looked down on the latecomer workers in this morning's parable, the Red Door complainers were unable to see those who used our pantry as their equals. If they couldn't regularly afford desserts in the days they had been tight on funds, why should the pantry clients be entitled to them? I learned an important lesson. It's not simple to try to make things better than they are. And don't expect to get credit for your efforts, because sometimes you will receive criticism instead. I'm not so sure this parable is about salvation for Gentiles. Maybe it's about feeding hungry people, whether we think they deserve it or not. Maybe it's about trying to level the playing field, whether that's done with food pantries, SNAP benefits, free breakfasts and lunches for school children, daily meals delivered to the elderly and homebound, or raising money for Crop Walk so as to support the local food bank and ensure that people around the world are fed. Maybe it's just a story about a God who loves everyone, and maybe it's a call for us to do the same. I'll close with the words of Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes, you are his body. Christ has no body now on earth but yours. Amen.